Chapter 1 Armand's introductions went. It was Sanui around the level of greeting the harpy who had just eaten your Aremna at a polite tea party. The newly chosen, and utterly fake, Duke of Ashista watched his beloved Annabella staring at Sheba, as the ex-cat, now in human form, ignored her. Sheba was in her frill once a cat, always a calf mode today, stretched out full length on the back of a couch in one of the palatial sitting rooms of the castle. How she didn't roll off, he had no idea. Occasionally, she would lick her arm but mostly looked to be taking a short nap. She was also entirely naked. This would have been fine, had Sheba still been a Persian cat. As a human, and utterly voluptuous, Middle Eastern woman, not so much. Armand had only himself to blame for this, of course, as he'd been the one to transmogrify her when she'd been about to die from old age. 18 was quite elderly for a cat. As a human, it was only the beginning. It was rather a frowned-upon practice in the magical world, but that didn't mean it didn't happen. Sighing, he heard his friend Hubert trying not to chuckle and couldn't really blame him that man's ex-mastiff sidekick had adapted to clothes much more readily and less embarrassingly than Armand's Persian. Proving this now by wearing a brown suit, even if it were one which didn't quite work for him and was always a little rumpled, Brutus let out a small whine. The dogman had been much too fond of Sheba when they had both had 4 legs. Now that they were the same species, Armand decided not to go there. Trying to reason with her, and knowing she was probably doing this on purpose, he sighed, "Sheba, haven't we discussed how important clothes are for you now?" Annabella had come up to take his hand, but he could sense her trying to hold back her laughter, too. He supposed he should be grateful that she was so understanding. Most new brides, which, in Wichton's, she was, would not take quite so calmly to discovering a naked woman lounging around her husband's house. Sheba raised her head to stare at him, her sage green eyes no longer cat-like but still rather intense. For a moment, there was a noise in her throat like a RMV. "Don't like clothes?" they hinted. Sitting thinner on the sofa's back, in a way which would have made nearly anyone else fall off, she looked down at her human body. "Still miss my other nipples." Looking over to Armabella, Armand saw her biting her lip, trying desperately not to laugh, her whole form shaking with it, her lovely hazel eyes alight. The beautiful hair he saw as blonde, and she always demanded was brown, was slightly mussed from travel, and she was so perfect he could barely stand it. That she was so understanding of Sheba's ex-cat show of witness just made him love her RMR. There really hadn't been enough time for a proper honeymoon yet. Of course, Hubert was also amused. The older man's light blue eyes shone, his long, if receding, blonde hair shaking slightly, as he tried to hold back his laughter. Although dressed in his usual, invocable style, ready for any legal negotiation or magical spell which might prove necessary, he looked as though, had he not been trying to be polite he would have been howling. Poor solid, squat, bald Brutus was also watching, although, in his case, he was whimpering and looked like he wanted to drool. Staring back at Sheba, Armand sighed. Sometimes, he felt very guilty for having transformed his former feline companion. He wondered how much of her complaints were meant to keep the upper hand and how many were real. Clasping Annabella's fingers more firmly, he tried to bring his former pet to heel. "Sheba, behave." She just raised a delicately formed eyebrow at him. Her long, black hair flowed magnificently, blocking absolutely none of the view of her flesh. "This is Annabella. She's my partner now." One of the best parts of his memories of the last months had been their partnering ceremony, informal though it had been. Among other things, it had been a lovely break from Tilly and Errol's lessons about how to be a duke, which was a role he was still unhappy being forced into, not that the magical council cared. It hadn't escaped his notice that Errol seemed only too happy to turn the entirely imaginary title over to him. She's not going anywhere, no matter how outrageously you behave. I hope. So you need to get used to her. Sheba finally stood, which only showed off her body completely. Armand tried not to stare at the ceiling, making himself keep watching her face. Although Sheba would always be a cat to him, having her stroll around as a naked woman could be very disconcerting, which she clearly knew. The ex-cat sauntered toward them in a strut straight out of Seduction 1 but, then again, that walk had always been fairly feline. Finally, she stood inches away from Annabella, her green eyes watching her calmly. To her credit, Annabella didn't flinch or challenge her or even blink. She just smiled calmly and said, "I'm pleased to meet you, Sheba. Armand is very fond of you." "Oh, sweet Kate. Please don't let Sheba spit at her." His ex-pet had never been quite so uncouth before, not in human form, but there was always a first time. Sheba just watched the woman, although she did take in a visibly deep breath. From talking to Brutus, Armand knew that she didn't retain her cat-like sense of smell, but it was still more refined than a normal human's, mostly because she knew what should be there and could find the small traces from habit. He was certain that she would pick up his bond with Annabella, then, probably already had, which would account for this particularly pointed display. The standoff lasted for a full minute, although it certainly felt longer. Hearing Brutus audibly whining, he wasn't certain whether it were from tension or lust. Finally, Sheba raised an eyebrow at Annabella, her face twisting a little. "Meh," she murmured, then turned to walk, very slowly, away. It was a rather mesmerizing sight, as it was meant to be. Armand had to shake his head, thankfully distracted by his partner's words. "I see she found the red punves Errol gave in." Glancing down, now noticed the ankle-aching stilettos the ex-cat wore. Somehow, she still moved gracefully in them, although they were a dubious gift to pass on to a secretary, which had been Annabella's role for the last Duke. Errol had explained. Apparently, they were only one of several such presents the man had given, thinking, once he got her and Armand together, that Armand would enjoy them. Clearly this whole soulmate-finding gig, which was all the dukedom really was, could lead to some pretty serious misunderstandings, if he weren't careful. Thankfully, Annabella had just thought Errol insane and hadn't responded to what seemed to be his obvious cornons. Given that his other supposed secretary, and actual life partner Tilly, had enough sorceress powers to turn him into a small grey squirrel if she chose, Errol was lucky that she was so understanding. He would have appreciated Armabella's unflappable reaction even more, as well, had he not known that it was all part of her rather too frequent tendency to underestimate her beauty and worth. It was a path established by her extremely neglected past, and one he spent every moment trying to teach her to let go. More than this, though, Armand rather questioned Errol's taste, the heels meaning nothing to him. He liked Armabella best when she was just in a comfortable pair of jeans and a shirt, although she'd been dressing more professionally ever since he'd had the dukedom turned over to him as his primary secretary. She had a role to keep up. She looked good now, but he missed the jeans. Either that or naked. Naked definitely worked for Hainu too. "It's fine," Annabella turned to him, once Sheba had left the room, clearly misunderstanding his thoughts. "I could never have pulled them off without breaking a leg, anyway." Brutus just whined. To Armand's surprise, Hubert came and clapped him softly on the shoulder. "She's attached to you. Give her a while. Besides." The barrister smiled. "You just left her for, how many months? You knew she would get her revenge for your desertion somehow." Sighing, Armand wanted to defend himself. It wasn't as though he could have taken her on his last job as an Akumakari Yudo. Being an Akuka was dangerous, demon hunting requiring total focus, as Armabella had discovered when they rescued her from her evil family home and the demon who resided in it. His cover working for Beatrix, the woman who had kidnapped Armabella as a young child, the woman he was unfortunate enough to have as his grandmother, had not made his demon hunting J0B any easier. Even had Sheba behaved as the perfect human, Beatrix would have destroyed her at the first opportunity, for so RMNY reasons. He wrapped his hand more tightly with Armabella's, hoping it didn't look to Hubert like what it was, a plea for strength. Annabella would understand, but, then, Armabella always did. In just the first week after they had rescued her from the demon, she had gone from confused and overwhelmed by the very fact that magic existed to completely convinced and well on her way to understanding every lesson which led her closer to her conversion into her hill sorcerer's powers. It was an amazing transformation and a heartening one to see her magic no longer being drained away by Beatrix. That she would soon have at least 20 times his strength only made him prouder of her. Hubert and Errol had even taken to calling her Maître, which was a title reserved for those witches who were very close to converting. Armand didn't think she was actually there yet, but he recognized that the day was coming when he would be the much weaker partner. Looking at her, loving her, he smiled. She was wearing a raspberry suit, her brownish blonde hair a little wild but more under control than it had been any time during those first few days of horror he had known her. He especially enjoyed the way the lighter streaks would catch the moonlight. Later tonight, he had every intention of taking her out into the garden to enjoy it in frill. He only hoped they could without naked cat interferences. He didn't get a chance to answer Hubert, hearing an amused, "Well, that went better than I expected" from the wall behind him. Sighing, he turned to see a Faranalaya, beautiful Indian face in a large, ornate mirror. Mahima Tejasvini Patel, the sorcerer better known as Tilly, had returned to the magical council, possibly partly to wait out her pregnancy in a less dangerous place than in the field, but she definitely kept an eye on them. "You never did believe in cell phones, did you?" he asked. There was a little whatever. Wave to her hand. "Technology is such a bore. Besides, if I can't use the council's power to make this calling more secure than a cell, I should just retire as a sorcerer." Errol poked his sandy head in, blue eyes shining, waving behind her. It was no surprise he was there, as he was never far from the woman he loved. Annabella waved back, as Tilly went on. "I see you're settling in just fine. Remember the basics I taught you?" "For now." Armand tried manfully not to roll his eyes, finishing for her. "Study the list of names of those who do and don't know about the dukedom and get ready to ignore or bespell away any confusion in the Arundanes." There tended to be a lot of that, given that the dukes were switched out whenever it was convenient or necessary, with no mention of the previous ones. Pick back up on the parties and places Errol had chosen before and start matching those who should meet, he continued. Managing not to sigh, he reminded himself that his role as love connector, as Errol referred to it, was important. Magic, and the world worked better when there was more true love in it. Still, it just wasn't as exciting as demon hunting. "And I can check out the rumors about some dangers with the Queen Mary so long as I'm back for the monthly council meeting at midnight on the 15th. Annabella looked confused, an expression he hadn't seen for a couple of RMNTHs now. It was adorable, and he'd kind of missed it. "Wait. Queen Mary? Is this a person or the cruise ship?" Ocean liner Hubert, Tilly, and Errol all said at once. "OIQY, whatever. Isn't it docked as a hotel now?" "In Long Beach, California," Tilly nodded. "And there are dangers with it." Armand sighed. He'd kind of forgotten that he hadn't told her about it. Apparently, he'd been way too focused on taking over the dukedom. "It was supposed to be my next job as an Akuka, my last one now, I guess." Admittedly, in those first few weeks together, it had been very difficult to talk about normal, everyday things once they were alone. "Okay, so we did kinda have a honeymoon." Trying not to get lost in the very pleasant memories, he continued explaining. There are some rumors about the ghosts there. There seem to be even more of them than usual, and they are apparently getting out of hand. Annabella looked around them. How are we supposed to get you into your rounds as the Duke and still cover that? Smiling, Tilly answered. It won't be that hard. The two of you will take on this one last job, together this time, and then you'll return to his new duties as the Duke. Annabella didn't look convinced, but Armand tried to reassure her. The rooms may be nothing. At worst, it will probably be a sinful exorcism. I doubt it will even last a COLVIE of days. Annabella raised an eyebrow but wasn't allowed to go on, Tilly interrupting. It looks like you've got it all in hand. Auntie, forget about visiting Freddy in the basement, well, the dungeons. Annabella looked even more surprised, and Armand tried to hide his smile. Although she had been living in this house, castle, really, for a few years as Errol's secretary, there had been quite a few secrets kept from her before. Like the fact that magic even existed. Her voice was pointed. You're keeping someone in the dungeon? She appeared ready to to their immediate rescue. No, Tilly shook her head. He's a troll, and he's much more comfortable down there than in one of the guest rooms. He then eaten to quit the last time we put him in the blue-panelled room. Annabella just stared at her. I'm not surprised. Those panels have satyrs on them, and what some of them are doing to the women around them would make a porn star blush. Okay. Scratch the garden walk. Annabella and I need to examine those panels. Giving a small puff, Tilly waved away her concern. 3 dukes before Errol was a satyr. Believe me, his partner was delighted by those panels. She rolled her eyes. He will not shut up about them, Armand broke in. Living in the dungeons probably has more to do with his size. Trolls are often 400,500 pounds with very dense bones. Put them in a delicate, antique bed, and it's in splinters before they've barely sat down. Tilly nodded. Besides, Freddy has a unicorn convenience, and, if you like your linens, you do not put a unicorn in a bed. Annabella seemed to reluctantly agree, as Tilly went on. Just let him do his gardening and go down from time to time to see if he needs anything, and he'll be quite contented. As Tilly nodded a goodbye, Errol waving behind her, Armand hoped so, and the mirror went back to only being a mirror. Despite boot canv, he really didn't feel ready for this job. Smiling, Annabella looked once more like the woman she'd become these last few months, taking his arm and leaning into him. You'll be fine, my lord. Her eyes shone. Part of him wanted to encourage the wicked glow, especially since she'd started calling him that in bed occasionally. Neither of them were complaining about the results, and he couldn't imagine a time they wouldn't be gleeful equals. I'm certain of it, she beamed. Sighing, he nodded. With her at his side, he hoped so. Fighting demons, he was good at it. Acting as though he were to the manor born was going to take a lot more work. Chapter 2. Annabella as a child, Annabella had wondered what it would be like to have an animal companion. So now the staring contest she was having with an extremely woman hadn't been part of that imagined world. Finally, she spoke, which was probably an ex-cat victory, but whatever. All right, Sheba. You may have that blue dress. The cat /woman was already wearing it anyway, so why make a fuss? Besides, it was silky and clung to Sheba's every curve as though it were in love with her. On Annabella, it more resembled a sack. But you may not wear it without underwear. Annabella saw her start to open her mouth. I know you don't like them, but you can't be let out around strange men looking like that. Because, especially with her cat-like aura, the outfit pretty much put out a "Hey, baby" sign to anyone passing. Sheba sulked slightly and started to slink away. Hubert will take you to a lingerie store. It would serve the man right for the way he'd laughed when she'd first started trying to learn magical words. Sorceress she might be becoming, but her language skills still sucked, and magical words had originated in all portions of the globe. Hopefully Brutus, who was always with his old master and friend, would survive the longing of sitting and watching Sheba choose her undies. Armand, who was sitting on the bed near her, gave her a look which was half amusement and half concern, which was pretty standard lately. The man loved her, but he sometimes didn't seem to get her. Still, seeing him sitting there made her start pondering ways to get everyone else out of the house for other, definite reasons. His modern black suit fit him beautifully well, emphasizing the tone he'd gained from years of fighting all the meaner denizens of the magical world. His long, auburn hair was down to his shoulders and showed a few of the curls he tried so hard to hide, and the green eyes in that handsome face just made her want to climb into his lap. Sadly, now wasn't the time. Her warning look was the only sign of what she was about to do, which sort of backed why she left him so perpetually confused, as, with an effort, she refocused on Sheba. It occurred to her that most women were very lucky that there weren't RM Rex cats in the world. Sheba was beyond Busha, so much so that no other woman could covet. And the fact that there was this sweet sort of innocence to her, too, just made anyone with eyes want to hold her. Although Armabella didn't really swing that way, she understood why poor Brutus drooled. It also meant that she had to play the wet blanket, made an aunt chaperone to her, or would soon, anyway. "You'll need them if you're going to join us on the Queen Mary." Armand's eyes went wide, but he said nothing in front of his ex-pet. Sheba's eyes went even wider, but she let out an excited, "We all," and took off down the hall, although whether to tell Brutus or to demand that Hubert take her to that store right now was uncertain. And no cat noises. Armabella yelled after her. There was only so much they could explain away to the mundanes. Waiting for a moment, undoubtedly to be certain the ex-cat was out of hearing, Armand moved closer to his partner. Probably understandably, he looked worried. "She's not ready for that." Sighing, Annabella put her hand over his. They'd both been packing their suitcases for this last Akuka job, and, honestly, the magic had been helpful. One small bag couldn't otherwise hold several of his, or her immaculate suits plus other necessities and all that exorcism equipment. In a lot of ways, she was sorry to always be springing things on him, but she had started to understand her new role, too, in a way she never had when Tilly had been occupying it with Errol. The Duke's main assistant was the guiding force, the one who made all the real decisions which the Duke then claimed to be his. She was the one no one really noticed, the silent presence half a step behind him. It was why, although, apparently, it was normal for her to be the Duke's actual partner, it was traditional to pretend that there was no romantic relationship between them. The Duke was the actor, ever on stage, both looking for and making connections between souls who should be together, as well as deflecting the questions of those who might wonder about whether anything he claimed were true. It was he who would have to maneuver through an entire ballroom of people, charming, manipulating, softly coercing, while the assistant sailed along quietly in his wake. He didn't have time to ramp big plans. He had to concentrate on being on. Sometime, Annabella thought, they really should discuss this, as it had to be difficult for him to adjust to the change in her. They'd met, she'd been a scared and completely ignorant girl. By a few days later, she had been, quite literally, controlling almost every aspect of his life. Had their positions been reversed, she doubted she would have been comfortable, although Armand somehow never objected. Still, now wasn't the time. Now was a time to talk about cats and queens. She needs this, Armabella assured him, just as she saw a Clairlune message Hubert had sent sparkling before her eyes. It read, "Fine. But you are so going to be studying transmogrification when I get back." Annabella groaned, and Armand let out a chuckle, as he too knew it was the subject she hated the most. He still carried around her first assignment, which was supposed to be turning a matchstick into a converse. Instead, she'd created a small, green enechanical frog which croaked whenever danger was near. Clearly, it wasn't where her magical talents, whatever those might prove to be, lay. Still, Armand looked back to her, waiting for Aremra. At least they could talk without ex-cat interruptions for a while. She put her hand on his arm, trying to explain. I know you still see her as a cat, and she is a companion you love, but she is not an animal anymore. You can't just leave her some magically refilling food and a self-cleaning litter box and walk away for a couple of months. Armand had the grace to wince slightly. I did have friends drop in to sit with her from time to time. I really didn't abandon her completely. I know that, but does she? Granted, she'd never been lucky enough to have a pet, but she did own people who had. From what I can tell, a dog or cat is convinced you've left for good if you even go away for a few hours. A few months must feel like you don't love them and never did. Pushing his suitcase out of his way, Armand sighed and sat down. I never really thought of it like that. Smiling at him gently, she didn't go into fuss. In some ways, Armand had lived a rather selfish life, doing what he wanted when he wanted. Granted, the less selfish part of that had been that what he wanted was to save innocent people from demons, but it had been a lot to ask of a cat to put up with the long absences that had involved. More than this, even when he'd transmogrified her, he'd still kept the old mentality about their roles. But that wasn't going to work with her in human form. She loves you, Armand, but you've given her a human life of her own, and she needs to learn how to live it. Probably the only way to do that, at least at first, is to give her some kind of a role, like Hubert did with Brutus. Although, admittedly, turning a mastiff into a law partner had been an odd choice. And that is. And wondered, although he wasn't really fighting her. Well, not a secretary, she agreed. Anything subservient was just out for a cat. I was thinking more a sister. In some ways, willful daughter might work better, and, as she had learned since their first days together, Armand was actually around 50. It was just that, in magical years, this was considered somewhat akin to being 25, 01D enough to be out on his own but still young enough that people wondered if he had really settled on what he was going to do with his life. Since Sheba had become a human at the whopping age of 18, quite elderly, in cat years, and had been vaguely not accepting the change for years since, as Armand worked various jobs around the world, she could easily have pulled off being a 21-year-old daughter. Still, since Armand appeared to be maybe in his late 50s, this wasn't really going to work. The other issue with fuss, of course, was the one his raised eyebrow rather pointed out. Sheba had been a black Persian cat. She had become human, she had kept to some of those traits by becoming an extremely beautiful, Middle Eastern woman with long black hair. True, she had a vaguely French-Canadian accent, somewhat like Armand's, when he wasn't bespelling it to sound more authentically French, not that American ears like hers could really spot the difference, but Armand's background was French and European. Although Sheba, and probably 100 of her most recent relatives, had never seen Iran, even with the ex-cat issue aside, they looked nothing alike. She shrugged. So a half-sister, then, or even a bratty step-sister would work, she thought about it. Actually, that last one might be the best. Her rebelliousness can be written off as her objection to your parents sending her off with you. And she thought about it. Are we going to the Queen Mary with you as the Duke of Winchester? He nodded. For once, she hadn't made the plans. It was odd not having quite such a purely secretarial role in Ulnra. Then it can be your mother who married her father. That way, she is not actually part of your noble line, just married into it. Teaching a cat to act human was one thing. Teaching her to behave like an aristocrat was something else entirely. She shrugged. It's probably also enough scandal that if you're annoyed with her, people will just take it as your annoyance with your mother wandering off to marry some Middle Eastern billionaire. Having this fictional noble mother remarry someone outside her race after her husband's death was one thing. Having her marry outside her class was unthinkable. Unfortunately, it was a backstory which depended greatly on playing to stereotypes, but many things about the dukedom did. Besides, Armabella had been raised in an Erica since she was 3. Families of varying shades were not unheard of, but anyone who thought that meant that they'd just be accepted without question or comment was fooling themselves. Sighing, Armand nodded. Fine. But you'll need to help me get her to behave, as much as that's possible. Annabella really wanted to say that she knew the magic bullet to this. Sheba, they were probably going to have to change that name, just needed to emo he truly loved her. After all, she'd given him her entire feline life, much of it being abandoned while he went off to save the world from Danans. She really just wanted to emo that she was more than an object to him still. She suspected that Hubert was going to be extremely efficient in buying Sheba's necessities. He wasn't a man with enough sexual interest in one end to enjoy fantasizing his way then off the lingerie department. Turning to the other subject she wanted to discuss without cat interruptions, then, and leaving the far thornier emotional issues for another time, she smiled at him tentatively. That just leaves the issue of what kind of duke you're going to be. Clearly, he had no idea what she was talking about, so she tried again. Errol was the silly, flirtatious, ostentatiously gay duke. It was really rather an insulting stereotype now that she thought about it, but it had kept women from trying to get him to marry them, and he hadn't needed a girlfriend for show, so he didn't irritate Tilly, whose Indian heritage would have drawn unwanted comment and attention and who was in the traditional, "No, I'm not his girlfriend" role. Armand glowered. There's no way I'm swarming around like that. Hubert would kill me. Annabella didn't disagree. The only way Errol had gotten away with it was that his main magical power seemed to be an absolutely irresistible charm. She tried another option, then. The one before Errol let everyone know that he was in mourning for his late wife, so no one questioned the constant presence of his secretary. The Sinvathi had apparently worked to disarm people, as well. Rolling his eyes, said Sinvli, no. She looked at him curiously. He went on. I'm sick of pretense. I've been an Akuka for 30 years now, and I've finally found you. His hands took both of hers tenderly. I'm not going to pretend I'm miserable all the time anymore. Smiling, she was too flattered to disagree. Still well, according to Tilly, that leaves about 4 other archetypes, the mean duke everyone's too afraid of to question or flirt with, the spacey duke who can't keep his mind on one thing long enough to be permed down on anything, the loyal duke whose fiancé is in another country and who's always roaming off to talk to her, and the crotchety old duke who barely hears what anyone says. She looked him over. Who you're much too young to play without a spell or favor. She watched him think about it for a while before he looked back to her. No. None of them will work. Staring at him curiously, she wondered where he was going with this. If Tilly were right, and there was no reality she could imagine where Tilly wouldn't he be right. Those were pretty much all the choices those whom the magical council had chosen to be the Duke had. Looking into her deeply, his gaze beat her to understand. I don't want to hide you. I don't want you as someone who just wanders along behind me. And I want everyone to know why I'm not available. Annabella had been warned about this. According to Tilly, pretty much every duke decided that they were going to be the one to break tradition, that they would proudly declare this woman by their side to be their girlfriend or fiancée or wife. Tilly had also warned that, if Annabella let him take this path, she'd be forced to spend a month or more bespelling every single person he knew in the future when he finally settled down into one of the acceptable roles, once he realized his noble intentions just weren't working as he'd hoped. She had to admit that she didn't like this path, either, but also didn't see much way out. She tried to explain. If a duke is dating or engaged to someone, it's not going to be him everyone focuses on. It's her. She shook her head. And if you really think you won't lose everyone's respect the moment they look at me, you're crazy. Seeing that he was about to object, she went on. I'm not elegant or aristocratic. I get army-led at secret signs and in jokes. I want to punch people in the throat when they exclude someone simply because they are not one of us. He smiled but let her finish, and she did appreciate his look of love. I can't come along beside you, my clothes all wrinkled and dishevelled because, let us face it, my love, wrinkled and dishevelled is just who I am. And not even in the proper I'm wearing RNY great-great-great-great-grandfather's clothes while I'm gardening, because why wouldn't I, way? Seeing his objections, she sighed and pressed on. If you were a real duke, you could flout expectations and just face quiet exclusion. As the magical council's duke with a mission, you can't. You need access, and you need respect. You have to be someone no one questions. Otherwise, you'll never be able to go out and do anything you want was pretty much the way this job worked. There was truth to this, and she knew Armand saw it, but he was stubborn. As it was his love for her which was making him dig in his heels, she appreciated it. But still, how about this, she tried finally. This Queen Mary trip is kind of our maiden voyage. We'll fry it your way. Which, sorry my love, is just plain cray-cray. And if it doesn't work, we'll abandon it when we return. Chances are good we won't see too many people from the hotel again in the future, so we won't have as many people to bespell if it doesn't work, which, seriously. Me as a duke's girlfriend? Ha! It won't. She knew he saw her ulterior motive, but he accepted the offer, clearly taking this as his opportunity to change her mind. Annabella did, too, even if she knew his plans would never work. Besides, this was supposed to be a fast trip. Maybe he'd learn quickly just how unlikely she was as his public companion, and then they could get on with keeping their private lives private. Chapter 3 Armand T. was half a week later that their luggage was being carried by a porter into the great, permanently docked ocean liner, as Armand stood staring at it with Annabella and RT at his side. Sheba and Brutus were following the bags, entirely unaffected by the sheer magnitude of the ship. Thankfully, Annabella voiced his thoughts. Wow. Big? He just nodded. Uncertain what it was caused by exactly, Armand felt rather overpowered by the sight. Finally, he voiced a theory. Do you think we feel so dwarfed because we're young enough to have missed the era or when all of this was normal? Even he felt how tortured that sentence was and realized he really had been completely thrown off by the sight. Speak for yourself, my dear, Hubert corrected him, and Armand reminded himself that the man was about 70, which would have put him around during the latter days of ocean travel. Still, being magical, he didn't look over 35. Even as a witch-hin elf, Armand could sometimes forget. Besides, it was hard to focus on anything besides the sight before them. The ship just went on and on. Several stories tall, it stretched out by what Americans would measure as several football fields. Then again, Americans measured nearly everything in football fields. If they were invaded by hordes from hell, the news would have reported it as how many football fields worth of demons there were. Still, it wasn't like he'd never been in a big building before. Sunnier when it was a ship, though, I think. Annabella broke in. It's the thought of being in the middle of the wide sea with nothing but this between you and a watery grave. The two men looked at her. What? I've seen Titanic. Hubert smiled at both of them. I think it's just that we are used to seeing ships as small things nowadays, or not seeing them at all. Even in a port city, they are usually far away, their magnitude not as daunting. If portals ever become normal for mundanes, they'll probably be amazed by the size of a normal airplane. Halfway up the to reception, Sheba turned back and stared at them with a look which definitely reminded everyone that she had once been a cat. She was dressed beautifully now, in a blue silk number he missed seeing Annabella in, convolute with heel, gracious lady, broad-brimmed blue hat. The milliner, London being one of the few places left where a hat maker could still make a living, had nearly had a fit of delight in matching her every dress, and, especially since she'd been doing her best to act human, Armand didn't have the heart to tell her that hats really weren't normal outside of formal events or royalty. Thankfully, the whole daughter of a Middle Eastern billionaire cover also gave a lot of leeway for odd behavior. Being wealthy often did. They started to follow, then, Armand changing the subject, although he kept his voice low in case he had overlooked any nearby Arundanes. Couldn't we take the portal? He looked over at Hubert. And why are you here again? Grinning, Hubert answered. 1. This is your first outing as the Duke of Winchester. You need to arrive in grand and human style. 2. This is your first outing as the Duke of Winchester, he repeated, smiling. In case you need advice, I'm here as your advisor. If you really screw things then I'm here as your attorney. Armand gave him a look which made him laugh. Although I'm also here mostly on vacation, so don't screw this up. 3. Annabella is still trying to catch up on 25 years of magic lessons. He raised an eyebrow, as they made their way up the steep walkway. If you don't want her to convert into a sorcerer while her magic is still wild, she really can't afford to take any time off. As much as Armand would have liked this to be a sort of honeymoon, he saw Hubert's point. Wild conversions had a bad reputation for a reason. It would be much safer to get Annabella as trained in the ways of magic as possible before her own natural magic asserted itself completely. Annabella took his hand, smiling, and he sighed. There really hadn't been enough alone time with her. Still, as much as he wanted to focus on this, he was also here on his last job as an Akuka. If there was something happening on this ship which was more than just the expected amount of spirits any ocean liner of its time might attract, he had to remain highly focused to discover it. It has an atmosphere, doesn't it? Armabella noted, as they entered the check-in. It did. Everything was wooden and elegantly decorated and just definitely from another time. Even the carpeting was plush and rather Victorianly florid. It was somewhat like standing in an Art Deco masterpiece, and knowing they were going to be sleeping in it, like a night at the Elysium. The registration clerk ran a practiced eye over them and then looked a little convulsed. Armand didn't entirely blame him. Brutus and Sheba stood together, the dogman waiting patiently, short, bald, solid, and, as always, a little uncouth, as much as he tried, and Sheba now elegantly beautiful but also always with that air that there was something not quite normal about her. Armand had put on his most ponvous air which he hated, and Annabella was smiling quietly at his side, because she was, well, Annabella. She just didn't do ponvous. He loved her for that. Hubert stepped forward as the great man's spokesman. We're the Duke of Ashester's party. I believe we should be booked into THEE rooms. The clerk, a young, tall, thin man with slicked-back black hair, looked around this party, clearly playing spot the Duke. His eyes landed on Armand. He straightened, bowing his head slightly. Your Grace. Wow. He even got your title right. That took me at least a week, Annabella noted in his head, and he was very glad that she had agreed to share their thoughts. True, he had been able to send her just a few of his even when they had first met, but they had mostly been warnings. As they were somewhat undercover here, it would be exceptionally easier just to be able to say what they meant without listeners. Don't forget to bow your head back to him graciously, she reminded. Oops. Right. He gave what appeared to be the right signal, as the man grinned and checked them in. Maybe you don't work here unless you into pomp and circumstance? He theorized. She didn't actually answer, but he felt her agreement. A little while later, they were being shown into their stateroom, one of the grander suites on the same floor as check-in, by a bellman who was young as well as clearly and oddly nervous, which took to be some sort of strange reaction to being around a duke. Right now, the boy was giving a history lesson. The ship is decorated with 56 types of wood, as that was how many colonies Britain had at the time. Oh, yay! Colonialism, he heard Armabella ponder dryly and smiled, loving her all over again, as the boy went on. In fact, 6 of the types of wood used are now extinct, so it's even rare. Not only colonialism but ecocide, too. Annabella opined, and he had to fry not to laugh. Still, she went on. I have to grudgingly admit that it's beyond beautiful. The boy chatted on about the ship's many amenities in a quick way which said this was his usual practiced speech, and even he wasn't listening to the words which came out of his mouth. Armand noticed that Annabella was looking around. Kinda tiny, isn't it? Well, it's not a modern hotel. They needed to cram as many people on board, in as much relative comfort as possible in the first-class cabins, as they could. Still, she was right. By modern hotel standards, even with a separate sitting room, it was pretty damn small. He shuddered to think what the less luxury cabins would be like. Distracted for a moment, he didn't quite catch his cue, especially as Annabella broke into his thoughts. Hold off on that tip a second. I'm going to work on getting some information. Tell me, she noved toward the young bellman, smiling. The Duke thinks I'm silly, but I just love to hear about the ghost stories. He noticed she was putting on her soft southern accent a bit thickly. Honestly, if she'd been looking at him like that, he'd have told her every secret the ship held. She really has no idea of how attractive she is. What? She wondered. Never mind. Surprisingly, the bellman looked a little nervous. In some places, this would have made sense, but the Queen Mary advertised its ghosts as one of its attractions. It had ghost tours and Halloween events. There was no reason he shouldn't be jumping at the chance to get her to stay longer and sign up for an event or two. Yeah, the ghosts. He started looking around the room, as though there might be spirit eavesdroppers. Annabella tilted her head and looked sympathetic and sweet. It was both frue and a very expert act. She really was taking to her new role quickly. The bellman came a little closer, his voice dropping. If Armand hadn't been in her head, he might have missed what was said. Look, today's my last day here, so I'm going to give you a warning I probably shouldn't, and I don't think you'll get from anyone else. Her sweet and curious smile continued, and he applauded her choice not to interrupt. The ghosts have always been here, but lately. He trailed off, looking at her nervously and then around behind himself again. You know the stories of when this was a ship? Armand failed to point out that it still was, just a permanently docked one. They said you could always tell when there'd been a death on board, because everyone would get a whole lot more ice cream at Neil's, so they'd have Sunny cold to store the body. As he leaned in even thinner, Armabella snarled encouragingly. Let's just say that it'd be serious ice cream time around here lately. Leaning back, staring at Armand nervously, he started to back away. But you didn't hear it from him? He left before Armand had even gotten out a tip, which he supposed was for the best. He'd completely forgotten to get his money exchanged. As today had proven, he wasn't used to mundane methods of travel NETMRE. Annabella turned back, and it didn't surprise him that she kept the thought private. Did he just say that people have been dying here? Armand nodded but didn't know what to make of it, either. Apparently, his nice little spirit exorcism had just grown into a much more dangerous mission.